PowerPoint here in front of me, and yeah, so feel free to start whenever you like. It's good to see you that you're here with us in the flesh.
Yeah, and apologies, I've not been able to join as many this time as I hoped. It's been a bit manic at work, so but fortunately made it today. Just
great stuff.
Great, thank you for that, Andrew. So I've chosen today to focus on representations really of Shetland, as I'm hoping to complete the MA in Island Studies this year with Andrew's guidance. So yeah. I'm basically contractually bound to look at islands. Islands have always fascinated me for a number of reasons, but principally their isolation and uniqueness. The chance really to engage with and try to understand a society rather than simply scratching the surface, like when you visit a city, maybe. Of course, when you travel today, you know in most cases exactly what to expect. Everything's been done and photographed a billion times before. So I would personally give an awful lot to have been in the shoes of Martin or Sir Walter, sailing into the largely unknown to observe and record the place and its people. That was pretty much wholly alien to the majority of the world. In another module on island studies, I've looked at cultural distinctiveness in the Northern Isles, and I wanted the chance really to explore the debate about Shetland's Norse identity further, chiefly through the writing of Scott, who plays such an interesting role in its development. I've specifically chosen really today to limit it to Shetland rather than look at Orkney as well, mainly due to the time constraints, but also that Norse identity is arguably strongest on Shetland. So my main focus, as I say, will be on Scott, but also Martin as well. Next slide, please, Andrew. So the key questions I'm exploring in this presentation will be what clues essentially do we get from the texts as to the existence of a Norse tradition in the early 18th and 19th centuries, and why and how does this identity develop? Also, what do the writings and the Shetland example tell us about islands and their cultural distinctiveness? Next, please. So I'm going to start with a brief history of Shetland to give some context before looking at what the texts of Martin and Scott tell us about Shetland and its inhabitants a century apart, really. I'll try to find evidence of a Norse tradition in the stories of fairies and sea monsters before looking at the language as well. And I'll close by examining the kind of longer-term influence of Scott and his novel The Pirate, which was set principally in Shetland. Next, please. So, due to Shetland's rather unique history and geography, it remains, even today, culturally different to mainland Scotland, I would say. I think the name of Shetland itself derives from the Old Norse Hjältland, meaning hilt land. And Norse place names are in abundance across the islands. Hamnavoe, Trondra, Solomvoe, to name a few. The streets are named after St. Olav, King Harold. And I think in the past, the Shetland Times has had even a Norwegian News Digest column. I think it's unclear whether Shetland's kind of indigenous population of Picts was forced to emigrate by the Vikings, or whether they were just simply all killed or assimilated into the Norse realm. Regardless, the Norwegian settlement basically signified a kind of fresh start for society in Shetland, and I think many argue that at the start of Shetland's recorded history, they possessed a purely Norse culture. Shetland became integrated into the Norwegian state at the end of the 9th century and became part of an earldom that was led from Orkney. And Shetland's culture really remained firmly Scandinavian for the next kind of 4 centuries. The gradual Scottification, though, of Shetland began after the islands were pawned to the Scottish crown by Denmark in 1469. From then on, the Scottish Parliament began to legislate for Orkney and Shetland, and then the Scots law was basically replacing much of the local law that had been there. You can see in the great castles, the stone castles in Scalloway and Unst, built by the Scots in the 16th, 17th centuries, that they kind of intended to impose themselves physically on the islands, and perhaps in a way that the Norse hadn't. Scottification ultimately led to the kind of extinction, as I'll talk a bit about more, of the island's Norse language. obviously with more people coming from Scotland and living there. And I think by the 1800s, few Shetlanders would have considered themselves Norse, if they really knew what that meant in the first place. Conversely, however, by the kind of late 19th century, Norse culture kind of gained a place within Shetland's conscience, such that it's been a part of self-identification ever since. And the discovery or rediscovery, depending on your viewpoint, of Shetland's Norse links was primarily due to the emergence of Norse Romanticism within the 19th century literature. And also some of the anti-Scottish sentiment as well, blaming the landowners for some of the poverty on the island. So both these things I'm going to look at through the lens of Scott and Martin. Next slide, please, Andrew. So as we know, Martin we've looked at many times before, toured the Northern Isles at the beginning of the 18th century. And despite the obvious geographic incongruity, his description found its way into his description of the Western Isles. Scott, on the other hand, visited just over 100 years later in 1814 at the invitation of the lighthouse engineer Robert Stevenson. He basically had a 6-week holiday in the company of several of the commissioners of the Northern Lights, as they were known, on their yacht Pharos, as they toured around the Northern Isles, Hebrides and Northern Ireland as well. And Sir Walter described it as his voyage in the lighthouse yacht to Nova Zembla and Lord knows where. He basically saw it as an opportunity for new discoveries. He was writing a poem, I think at the time, The Lord of the Isles. And he kept a really detailed diary of the voyage, recording what he saw, did, thought. And this obviously proved very useful for later generations, and I think it was his main source for the novel The Pirate, which was published 1821. Next slide, please. Just some brief first impressions from Scott's writing. So his first impression of Shetland and Lerwick itself was favourable from the boat. It is a most beautiful place. The town, built irregularly on a hill, has a picturesque appearance. However, when he went on shore, things quickly changed. His opinion changed, and he decided it was a poor-looking place, largely because of the flag streets, but probably more to do with the fact that there were hundreds of drunken Greenland whalers engaging in riots at the time. So that probably changed his opinion somewhat. The houses as well, outside of Lerwick, he described as the most wretched, worse than the worst herd's house he'd ever seen. Next slide, please. And Scott's criticism kind of extended as well to the state of agriculture on the island. Outside Lerwick, he came upon a Norse mill, which he said was incapable of grinding more than a sack at a time. At one point on his travels, he meets a lowland Scot who's really frustrated by the resistance of Shetlanders to improvement, as he terms it. Basically, the locals insisting they would work as their forefathers did and nothing else. And there's a possibility this individual was the inspiration for a character in The Pirate who is similarly frustrated, called Triptolemus Yellowly. I think Scott, as I think we see, is a man that looks to the future, and he seems quite vexed by the kind of barbarous habits in agriculture, and the idea of not wanting to improve things concerns him. And there's also some evidence, I think, in Martin's text regarding improvement was on his mind. I think he closes his account with a kind of appeal to the islanders to take more control of their fishing rights in the face of what was a kind of foreign invasion of boats. Next slide, please. I wanted to just focus briefly on the spirit of the islanders. The hardiness really impresses both authors. Scott states, I should have thought the settlers would have not feared the devil if he came by water. Both authors describe the Cradle of Nos, which you can see a picture of there. Basically, these two very high rocks, with the gulf between which you can just see there are some ropes attached to which is this kind of basket, the cradle, in which men would actually sit and travel across to hunt for eggs in Martin's time, as he describes. But by Scott's time, they were actually carrying sheep across one at a time in this thing to get to the other side, where there was some pasture on the top of that precipice called Holm. Scott also recounts the story of a man who was engaged in catching seabirds upon one of the cliffs with his father and brother, and all three are suspended by this cord. And at one point, the son notices that it's fraying and basically says to his brother, "Cut the cord below," basically send the father to death. But that brother says no. So this man cuts basically his brother and his father and doesn't think too much about it. It seems from Scott's description as they plunge to their deaths. So all in the name of a bit of danger and catching your seabirds. So yeah, so the spirit really does impress both authors on that one. Next, please, Andrew. Language is an important theme, I think, in both, and I think reference reveals much about the kind of melting pot of influences the island was experiencing, as well as the Norse tradition. In Martin's time, the inhabitants are said to generally speak English, but many do retain the ancient Danish language, especially in the more northern Isles of Shetland. There's also evidence of people speaking Dutch because of the number of the trade to the islands. And he also references the influx of visitors from Hamburg as well. I think by Scott's time, though, English really had completely replaced the ancient Norse language, Norn as it's known, due to the Scottification of the Isles, and I think the greater number of people from the mainland. And I think as well, the parliaments, the Scottish and English parliaments, were united in 1707, and that probably further weakened it as well, with London obviously being the main power. The only reference I could find to Norse tongue in the respective Shetland was in the sword dance, this traditional sword dance of Papastur that's described, where he makes clear actually the language is not Norse, which it presumably used to be, but it's now English. Scott does reference directly in respect of Orkney and North Ronaldsay Island that there is apparently people there that do still speak, and he mentions a story about someone a companion who travelled there and had met people that could and could sing songs in the traditional Norse, one called the Enchantresses. Next one, please, Andrew. Just moving on to tales of the supernatural, folk tales. It's fair to say I think both Martin and Scott's texts are full of references to this. Martin refers to sea devils attacking fishermen. Scott refers to a kraken off the coast of Scalloway, sea snakes as well. Fairies, as we know them, are referred to as trowels, which is derived from the Norse for troll. They steal children, live in the hills, basically generally make a nuisance of themselves. And I think these descriptions ended up having quite a major influence, I think, on the development of Norse romanticism in Shetland. Scott and others, I think, who later wrote, they wrote about the past belief in these supernatural beings. They kind of did so in order to develop their own narratives, but they did it based on their own understandings of the past culture and reality. I think in this field there are quite a few differing opinions about to what extent these are actually a reflection of Norse traditions, or were they in fact Scottish. I've read one of your own papers, Andrew, I think, where when it comes to the fairy legend, the Scottish contribution, I think you argue is actually greater than the Norse. So there is that debate, and also that the stories about trowels, for example, are mainly Scottish, and they're very similar to the Gaelic tradition, which is unusual, as most people don't associate Gaelic tradition as much with the Northern Isles. Next one, please. I think Martin and Scott were very aware of Shetland's past settlement, as I've said, by the Norse. But there's little in the actual text, aside from the references to language, that suggests that Shetlanders in this period regarded themselves in any way as say, Scandinavian. There is, however, evidence of an anti-Scottish sentiment in Shetland prior to this development of Norse romanticism. I think at least the Shetland people that were writing at the time, the elite, they'd kind of formed it. There was this other, this not so much maybe a Shetland identity, but they were united kind of in the opposition to what the Scottish rule as they saw it. So when Scott visited, he kind of saw a community, I think, in his view, in opposition to Scotland. And he could use that to overlay that with his own interests around Norse culture. And possibly one argument that it's kind of an us against them, you've got the local versus outsider kind of culture clash. The picture there is of the castle of Scalloway. That was built by Earl Patrick Stewart in the 17th century, I think. And in Martin's text, he says the inhabitants say this house was built upon the sandy foundation of oppression, in which the Earl obviously exceeded, and I think he was ultimately executed for his crimes. Scott refers to the same castle, same Earl. Describes the trial of the Earl and one witness from Zetland who refused to say a word until he was guaranteed that there was no chance of the Earl returning to Scalloway. So, just an example, really, of the oppression of the Scottish Earl. Next slide, please. So just want to talk briefly about Scott's novel The Pirate from 1821, which obviously took huge inspiration from his trip, but also enormous liberties with events. He transferred much of the action from Stromness in Orkney, where the tale of the original pirate John Gow took place, transferred that to Shetland, certainly due to its greater Norse tradition, perceived wildness, I think, compared to Orkney. And I think it's fair to say that The Pirate directly led to increased tourism to Shetland, greater interest for people who wanted to see the landscape, archaeological sites that Scott's described. But I think as well, though, this kind of Norse atmosphere that Scott had created was his own idea, really. Another example is the Pirate's main setting is in Sundberg, in the south of Shetland, on the mainland. There was a house there as well built by that Earl Stewart, which was already in ruins, I think, by Scott's time. And Scott changed the name of that place to Jarlshof, which is known as today. So that is basically carried on from Scott's creation. And it's now a regular tourism site when you go to Shetland. So just to conclude, I think the other kind of Norse influence in Shetland was clearly in decline by Martin's time, and it was virtually extinct by Scott's when we consider the use of language as I looked at. I personally find it hard to believe that Shetlanders felt Norse really in any way in the early 1800s, as the Scottish influence was really becoming kind of all-consuming. But Scott visited at a time, I think, when Shetland could kind of latch onto an identity which suited many of the islanders' kind of anti-Scottish sentiment. And I don't think it happened overnight at all, but Shetland because Shetland was far removed from the mainland and mainland Britain, outsiders kind of expected it to be different. And I think these expectations ultimately came to be embraced by the islanders themselves. And finally, more widely, I think, for the field of island studies, I think what these texts prove again is that kind of by showing the melting pot of ideas and beliefs in Shetland that were brought to the island from external sources, it shows that their culture really is indebted to its kind of interconnectedness to the rest of the world. So kind of my love of islands for their isolation, I think, says about more my desire to leave the city rather than the reality, which is that they are connected. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tom. Some very interesting material there, and it's good to be bringing our tour of the Highlands and Islands to the north, that we're going to explore a bit more soon. So, yes, some very interesting stuff there. Before I ask a question, Joe and Erin, I don't know whether either of you have been to Shetland. Well, I don't think you have, Joe.
No.
Have you any questions for Tom about what he has to say?
Yes, I have. Tom, you mentioned there's quite a lot of anti-Scottish sentiment. Was there any anti-English sentiment at all?
I didn't don't think I came across any specific anti-English reference. I mean, certainly Martin's time. I think the part of the was it 1707. I think that was the Parliaments were united,
Parliament.
so it was just
Yeah.
a bit before. Yeah. But actually, I'm trying to think in Scott's text. I don't think I did specifically. I certainly didn't pick it out.
Okay.
No.
No. Okay.
Thank you. Erin?
What was the question? My computer cut out.
What's your question? Do you have a question for Tom?
It's just a bad connection today. If I've noticed any, are you asking if I've noticed any of these different sentiments while living on Orkney?
You can give us that in a moment if you'd like, but we're just asking Tom questions at the moment. So do you have any?
Yeah.
Do you have a question for him?
Well, I was just curious on why would you choose islands in particular to base your master's thesis on?
I'm doing the island studies MA, so mainly for personal reasons I chose it. Just I've always had a fascination with islands, really, and I think it's been coming to the end of the 2 years now, but it's been a really great course so far. And yeah, I think as I said at the beginning, I kind of studied a bit around Shetland and Orkney from a cultural point of view in terms of their distinctiveness, and I think that Scott's texts, especially, and Martin as well, they kind of bring that out, and I think islands kind of can contribute an awful lot to the kind of the study of how culture kind of develops and how it's kind of influenced by external, internal sources.
Ah. So would you study different islands, like say Hawaii or Mary or Easter, or are you going to stop at these islands?
Well, for my thesis, I'm going to be doing Iceland in terms of the tourism there. But I think on the course itself, we've done an awful lot of islands from the hot to the cold. So, absolutely.
Thanks very much. Okay, well, I've got a couple of questions. You gave us a sort of flavour of Scott's description of Shetland, but I wonder, could you sort of give us a bit more, not detail as such, but in overall, what do you think his impression of Shetland was?
I think I touched on it when I mentioned about the agriculture and the improvement point. I think he was going there, I think, not really knowing an awful lot, but he was quite amazed at the kind of the lack of willingness to try and change things at that point, which kind of annoyed him, I think, in some respects. But then he also was very impressed with how the people survived in the climate and with the battles between the sea and the land and everything else. And I think ultimately he was inspired by it. So he obviously made a massive impression. But it's not to say he wasn't critical of it. But I think we know that he had a fascination with all things Norse beforehand, and in some ways he may have been looking for it. But I think ultimately it was an inspiration rather than it was. It's not to say you can't criticise, but it was an inspiration, I think, too.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's he does point out things that, negative things when he sees them, but overall the feeling you get is that he's visited, he's undergone an adventure, and he's got all the things you hope from an adventure. Yep. The exciting things, surprising things, the unusual things, the horrible things, but overall it's an adventure that he's very pleased to have undertaken. And as you pointed out in the fact that he very soon afterwards publishes The Pirate, where he pulls together his experiences from his voyage So he's obviously inspired. I just wondered, just the last question, do you not think you're sort of making too much of well, you stated quite categorically that you didn't think that the Shetlanders felt Norse by 1800. Do you not think that, well, could you expand upon that just a little bit, in the sense that we do know that there was quite a bit of Norse cultural material even available to Jacob Jakobsen in the 1890s. He was able to collect 10,000 Norn words from the local dialect.
I think what I read quite a lot was that by the early 1800s, certainly the use of language had pretty much faded, and I think Scott kind of proves that. But I think what I mean really is that certainly our concept of what a Viking is and everything else, and associating with that, I don't think the Norse in early 1800, the Shetlanders in early 1800 would have felt, if you'd asked them what are you, they wouldn't have said, oh, well, I associate with the Vikings and everything else. I don't think they would have said that, because I don't think they knew what that concept was. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, whereas going back many centuries to that, when they obviously were speaking Norse and they were ruled by Norway, that element I think had eroded by 1800. Not to say that, yes, there's obviously traces of it, but I think for the general Shetlander they wouldn't have felt Norse. But after Scott and everything else, towards the end of the 19th century, I think you would have got a different answer, I think, if you'd asked them.
Do you think that had anything to do with Scott's work? Because it certainly did, the sort of re-Scottification of Scotland, if you like. And he was credited with, reinventing Scotland after George III's visit. Do you think he had the same effect on Shetland as well, and Norse identity in Shetland?
I do. I mean, from what I've read, I think certainly things like those examples of where in the pirate he changed the name, I think, to Jarlshof of the house in Sundberg in the south of Shetland, and that has stuck, and that I think kind of undoubtedly kind of increased tourism as a result of that, and I think it was bringing it to the world for the first time when he was so famous and everybody was reading. I think he can only have done, really.
Yeah.
I did read somewhere that somebody argued that with the re-Scottification of elsewhere and the Gaelic culture, that kind of overshadowed the Norseness, but I don't know. That's not the impression I got from it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Tom. We're going to explore some of these themes a bit more now. We're going to explore the impact of Scott on the culture of the Northern Isles a little bit. We're going to have a look at some of the specifics of what he had to say on his trip. So just sort of following on from what you said, looking into things in a little bit more detail, and then we're going to look at other travellers and writers about, well, primarily Shetland, that both predate and post-date Scott to a certain extent. So it's going to be you've set the scene very nicely. So we're into the theme of travels to northern and Nordic Scotland. So thank you. Right, okay. It's good that we have this chance to expand the remit